Hello and welcome back to the Bomberman Retrospective. Today's episode will focus on the franchise's first portable entry, Bomber Boy, for the original Game Boy. Those of you in America will know this game as Atomic Punk, and those of you in the UK will know this more as Dynablaster. Since the platform is so limited, it'll be fun to see how they changed up the gameplay to fit onto the original Game Boy. So let's get to it. This game is another one that doesn't have much information out there for its development. Much like last time, most of what you can find about the people who worked on it can be found in the credits of the game itself. But one of the main things you're going to notice if you paid attention to the credits is that the team is mostly different this time around. The amount of different people they had working on this series at the same time kind of explains why so many of the games at the beginning all seemed different from each other. And this game is no different because its format is completely different from the ones that came before it. You don't go through every round in sequential order, you can pick whichever one you want, and depending on the one you pick, there's a different amount of levels. Also, in this game, every stage has its own individual gimmick now. Some are fun, some are inconsequential, and some are aggravating as hell. But we'll get to that later in the video. Once again, the visual style has been changed, but that's a given considering they're going from the PC Engine to the Game Boy. The sprites are definitely meant to resemble the NES game more than they are the PC Engine one. And that's not surprising since the Game B mode of this game is a complete port of the NES one, even though the sprite in that mode looks even more like the NES game. Like I mentioned before, this game introduces a new way of progressing through the levels. There are 8 rounds like the last game, but instead of them being in sequential order, you can pick whichever one you want to play first. This is good in concept because it gives the player the choice to play the game however they want and play the levels in whatever order they feel like. And since this is a portable game, that's really good because you're not always going to have time to play all 8 levels in a round. And that's also where the new password function comes in handy. It allows you to pick up from wherever you left off as long as you can remember the long ass passcode that they give you. The problem comes in when you look at the execution of the rounds themselves. Like I said before, every round has its own gimmick and they range from being unnoticeable or aggravating. The level you're likely to go to first, Grad, has one of the most aggravating ones. This level features a bunch of smaller mazes split up by unbreakable walls that you need to go through the opening doors in order to travel between. However, as far as I'm aware of, it's not set where each door will send you, so it can get really aggravating when one door sends you one place you don't want to go, and then when you go through that door, it sends you to an entirely different area. It's one of the most random elements about the game. Sometimes, if you re-enter a door that you got to the area from, it will bring you back to the area that you came from. Other times, you'll just get sent to a random part of the map. It can be even more aggravating when you get sent to an area that's in between 2 breakable walls. Since the doors themselves also close and open at random intervals, sometimes you'll just be stuck there for a while until the door opens back up. Windria is another level that has an aggravating gimmick. This round's gimmick is gusts of winds that push in different directions at random times. If you're moving in a direction that goes against the one that the wind is going in, you'll go super slow. But if you are moving in the direction that the wind is, you'll go faster. This becomes aggravating because since the wind changes at random intervals and you move so slow when you're moving against it, it can cause death a lot of the time. Sometimes the enemies are affected by the wind and sometimes they aren't. And this is when the resolution of the Game Boy's screen becomes a problem. Since the resolution is so small, they can't show a lot on one screen. So if an enemy is moving faster than you but they're coming from off screen, sometimes it'll be too late for you to try to act against it. The final round also has this problem since the unbreakable walls are all replaced with flames that insta-kill you the second you touch them. However, not all of the gimmicks found in this game are bad. Hevel's gimmick is unnoticeable to me. I'm still not quite sure what it is because it feels like it's just a regular game of Bomberman. Why this gimmick might seem like an eyesore at first, but it's actually not that hard to see stuff with it, and I actually kinda like having to discern what's an enemy and what's a block. The gimmicks were obviously introduced to make sure that the player didn't get bored while playing on a long road trip or something. And while once again this was a great idea in concept, the execution leaves a lot to be desired. Something that really helped with the difficulty this time around is the power-ups. And just like everything else, the power-ups have been changed too. Not the power-ups themselves, but more the way that they're used. If you enter the My Town section of the world map, then you'll enter a shop where you can buy up to 30 power-ups at a time. The currency used is gold that you get from racking up points in all the levels. You don't have all the power-ups accessible to you from the beginning though. At the beginning, the only ones you have access to are the elixirs, the bomb-ups, and the flame-ups. As you complete each round, you unlock a new one in order to be purchasable. Every round has a set power-up that it unlocks, so that means that you could theoretically unlock them in any order you choose. However, in my experience, unlocking the remote bombs first is the best option. The way the inventory works also changes depending on which power-up it is. For instance, with the remote bombs, you have to select that each time before the level begins. And each time you select it, it gets depleted from your inventory. However, with power-ups like the bomb-up and the flame-up, it stays with you through all of the levels in that round. I like this mechanic quite a lot actually, and making it so that some of them don't stick with you throughout all the levels makes it so that you can't just abuse them. Depending on the type of player you are, you have to legitimately choose which power-ups you want to use over the other ones and which ones you're willing to sacrifice and which ones you aren't. As far as I'm aware of, the only other game to use this method is the first Bomberman DS game, and it's kind of a bummer because I actually really like how it was implemented here. Much like the last game, new enemies were also introduced into this one. Unlike the last two games, some of them actually make an attempt to defend themselves instead of just running after you. Take for example Tuxie, one of the main enemies of Coalesce. The strategy of just locking the enemy in between the bomb and a wall won't work on them, because these enemies can just straight up freeze the bomb and then go about their day. This can make them extremely hard to deal with even when you have remote bombs, since they freeze faster than you can explode them. Some enemy behaviors can just be straight up aggravating though. Take Spid for instance. These enemies make a beeline for you and will follow you no matter where you go until you drop a bomb, in which case they will then speed away from it. If they run into a wall though, they won't start going in the other directions, they'll just stay running into the wall. Using this in the strategy to defeat them can actually be quite satisfying some of the time, but in levels like Arindria, they're just aggravating. These enemies aren't really affected by the wind, so they move at Mach speed all of the time. The screen crunch combined with that makes it even more aggravating because you're not quite sure if there's a wall on the other side or not. The rest of the enemies introduced in this game aren't that aggravating for the most part. Enemies like Bad Bomber or Robot only really get aggravating once they're in levels that have aggravating gimmicks. Even though this game can get aggravating at times, I still feel like I enjoyed my experience playing it. And no matter how aggravating the levels got, I never found myself getting to the point where I was waiting for the game to end like I was with the last one. If you change some of the gimmicks or even remove them entirely, I feel like this would be one of the best games for the original Game Boy. This game's story is a strange case, as the only version that has a written story is the American version. The Japanese version and the European version, renamed Dynablaster, just don't have one in their manual. In the American version, known as Atomic Punk, it takes place in a world called Atomica. This world was peaceful until it was invaded by radiation thieves who captured everybody who stood in their way. The only two people left were Bomberman and his son Atomic Punk, which is what the game was renamed to in America. The game contextualizes both the Game A and Game B modes as being them splitting up and go and fight in separate areas. Atomic Punk travels through the world of Atomica to free all the people who are captured, and Bomberman travels through the subterranean world. The attempt to contextualize both modes of the game was a good idea, but it doesn't really make much sense when playing the game. Game B is just a straight up port of the first game, so there's not anything that's changed in order to fit that story. And as far as I'm aware, Bomberman isn't mentioned in the Game A mode at all, though I could be wrong because I played all the way through the Japanese version, not the English version. And just like the NES game, the box art doesn't really portray anything from the story, which makes sense for the Japanese and European versions because they don't have a story, but the American versions have one, and not only does it have the worst box art out of them all, but it doesn't showcase anything from the story, not even Bomberman. It's nice that they tried to give a story to a game that previously didn't have one, but it doesn't really make much sense in the long run. Surprisingly enough, this time around the music isn't done by Jun Shikuma, but instead Yasuhiko Fukuda. Jun's music is only heard in the Game B mode, which is just a straight port of the Bomberman music. So all the new tracks in the game were done by Yasuhiko, and they're actually really good in my opinion. They're all super catchy, and they all fit their stages pretty well. Even with the stages I don't like, I feel like their music is really good. There's also a larger amount of songs than there's been in the past. Every stage gets its own individual song this time around, and not only that, but the shop itself has a different song, and the level complete screen. Even the world map has its own super catchy song that I can't get out of my head. The credits theme is also really good. It really gives the feeling like you just accomplished something when you complete this game. It makes beating this game feel so much more satisfying than it needs to be. If you ask me, I feel like this is one of the best soundtracks on the original Game Boy, period. The legacy of this game is much like the last one in some ways. Just like last time, it got high review scores at the time, but barely anybody talks about it anymore. It was well received, and it was praised for its password system, but just like the last game, it's just sort of fallen to the wayside. However, just like the last game, it did get some ports. They weren't anything big, they were just ports to later iterations of the Game Boy through the Bomberman collection. These versions add a slight bit of color to it, and as fun fact, the version you've been looking at this entire time. However, in Korea, there was a Game Boy Color release called Bomberman Selection, where all the games were fully in color. The game actually looks really nice, and if I knew it existed before I started recording, I would have used that version. I feel like even with some of its more frustrating mechanics, this game was one of the best ones we've looked at so far. And with it being the series debut on the Game Boy, it's a great start, which is a lot more than some other franchises can say. If you're a Game Boy or a retro game collector, I feel like this would be a great one to add to your collection. From what I can see, all the different region versions of this game don't cost that much on eBay. If you're not a collector, emulation is going to be your best bet.